If you want a snapshot of how global politics can fundamentally rewrite local demographics, well, look no further than Jamaica. We're talking about a community of people forced into servitude by one superpower, only for their descendants to become, part of the privileged elite. And in one incredible case, the fiercest abolitionist on a tropical island. It's quite a story.
That transformation is exactly what we're digging into today. And this deep dive, it draws directly from research related to a really comprehensive historical project. That's Glenn Carty's book, The Timeline of Jamaica. It covers the island from discovery right through independence, a huge undertaking.
Right. So our mission today is to trace the history of the Irish in Jamaica. This is a community arriving shortly after the English conquest of the Spanish in, 1655?
That's the one.
And it's a story of intense political upheaval, isn't it? Turning thousands of people from victims into, involuntary settlers, fundamentally reshaping the island's population.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the almost immediate link. You see the political fate of a nation over in Europe directly impacting the labor needs of a brand new Caribbean colony. It's so direct.
Okay, so to understand this influx, we really have to look across the sea, back to Ireland. Just 2 years before that 1655 conquest of Jamaica, Ireland was ending its own incredibly brutal war, the Irish Confederate Wars. It was absolute chaos, pitting Catholics against Protestants, royalists against parliamentarians, just turmoil.
And that whole scenario was really driven by the dramatic political upheaval back in England itself. You had King Charles I, who, he firmly believed in the divine right of kings, right? So he thought he could just disregard Parliament. His policies, his marriage to a Catholic queen, his disputes over money, it all led to his trial. And eventually his execution in January 1649, the charge: tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. Pretty stark.
Wow. And the central figure in all that upheaval, the Lord Protector, was Oliver Cromwell, a devout Puritan.
Yes.
Once the king was gone, royalists looked for refuge, didn't they? And they found it in Ireland, allying with the Irish Catholic Confederation, which effectively lined them up against the New English Republic.
Exactly. And Cromwell, he was determined to crush this new alliance. So he sailed to Ireland in 1649. And we know the massacres, places like Drogheda and Wexford, they really cemented his reputation for cruelty.
I have read about those.
Horrific. Cromwell's own report detailed it. Systematic elimination of resistance. He forbade sparing anyone found in arms. Think about it. About 2,000 people put to the sword in Drogheda in just one night. Officers knocked on the head, he said, the burning of St. Peter's steeple with people inside. Even friars, specifically mentioned as being knocked promiscuously on the head. The sheer scale of the violence, it was designed to terrorize, to break resistance.
And the result of that conquest wasn't just military, was it? It was economic, too.
Absolutely. The English confiscated a huge amount of land, about 40% of Irish Catholic land.
40%.
Yeah. And those deemed active participants in the resistance, they were deported, shipped off to the West Indies, basically as indentured servants forced to work for new English masters, usually for, like you said, 4 to 7 years.
So this mass displacement, it happened in stages.
It did. There were sort of 2 major waves. The first, the initial crackdown was from about 1641 to 1651. That focused on suppressing Catholic rights and power. But the second major phase, from around 1652 to 1660, well, that's even more tragic, really. It focused heavily on children and orphans. Kids left destitute by a decade of brutal warfare. They were transported to the colonies, essentially to be raised as forced laborers.
Unbelievable. So once Jamaica is secured by the English after 1655, these displaced Irish start arriving there.
That's right.
They came directly from Ireland, you said, but also from other places.
Yeah, from staging posts like Barbados. That's where some of the surviving members of the Drogheda garrison had initially landed, for example.
And they arrived with different statuses, right? Some convicts, some indentured servants.
Exactly. Convicts, indentured servants, and then later on some free Irish followed as well, seeking opportunities.
Now, when they first arrived, their situation, it wasn't good, was it?
No. Based on the records we have, the plight of the Irish workers was, and this is a quote, likely not much better than that of the newly enslaved African population. Especially in those early brutal sugar colonies like Barbados, they were treated horrifically.
Okay, wait. If they were treated that brutally, almost like the enslaved Africans, what was the critical difference? How did they manage to carve out such a different path later on? Wasn't the forced labor functionally interchangeable at the start?
That is the key question. And the critical difference was the time limit. It sounds simple, but it was everything. Slavery was for life, passed down through generations. Indentured service, however harsh, was finite. 4 years, 7 years, whatever the term was.
Okay. The end date.
Exactly. Once their term of service was up, the Irish gained options. Economic options, social options. They could join the local militia, for instance, which dramatically improved their standing and gave them some power.
Right.
Or they could move into trades or, crucially, acquire land. And this leads us to that shocking historical twist.
Which is the transformation from the oppressed victim to,
Yeah.
well, to the oppressor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the 19th century and many descendants of those original indentured Irish. We see names like O'Hara, O'Connor popping up. They were fully integrated into the colonial establishment. And how do we know this so clearly?
Yeah.
They appear in the 1837 slave compensation hearings. They were receiving payments from the British government for the emancipation of their enslaved people.
Wow. So they went from deported victims
To slave-owning elites within a few generations. That rapid ascent is, I think, the ultimate paradox of colonial Jamaica. It's stark.
and their numbers grew as well, didn't they? Because conditions changed on other islands.
Yes, exactly. Land was becoming incredibly expensive on smaller, established sugar islands like Barbados. Sugar cultivation just dominated everything.
So people left.
Yeah. We know approximately 5,000 Irish settlers actually left Barbados for Jamaica after 1660. They were frustrated, couldn't get access to land there. They saw Jamaica, this larger, newer colony, as a place of opportunity.
So they transitioned from being victims of displacement to becoming, well, an active and eventually privileged part of this new Caribbean economy.
Solidifying their status over the next century and a half. It's quite the trajectory.
Which brings us to, I guess, the great contradiction. You've got just a few generations separating the intense pain of forced migration and the privilege of ownership. So how did that now established Irish planter class react when, fast forward to the 1830s, another Irish nobleman arrives? Someone who stood utterly against everything they now represented.
Ah, yes. That brings us neatly to Howe Peter Brown. He was the second Marquess of Sligo, and he was appointed governor of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands in 1834. Now, Sligo was proper Irish aristocracy. And crucially, he was a plantation owner himself back in Ireland, having inherited 2 estates from his grandmother, Elizabeth Kelly.
Right, so the local planters, the Jamaican plantocracy, they must have thought, great, one of us.
They absolutely assumed they had a powerful, sympathetic ally, someone who understood their position. They could not have been more wrong.
In 1834, that's a really critical year, isn't it? Because that's when the Emancipation Act passed. But maybe just clarify quickly for you listening, that didn't mean immediate freedom, did it? We're talking about that 4-year apprenticeship period.
That's absolutely right. It was designed as a transition period. The formerly enslaved were forced to continue working for their former masters, often for minimal pay, for another 4 years. Sligo looked at this system, even this transitional system, and found it, quote, abhorrent. He was determined, he said, to establish a system that removed forever the reproach of slavery. Strong words.
So that's the moment the historical irony really bites. An Irish landowner expected to uphold the system. He immediately provoked the planter class. How? He ordered an end to inhumane punishments, the whipping, the branding, things like that.
Yeah, huge things at the time.
He also started advocating for schools for the African population. He actually built 2 schools on his own property. And he was the first plantation owner on the island to initiate a proper wage system for black workers during the apprenticeship.
The response from the establishment, it was swift. It was a revolt, basically, by the planter-dominated assembly. They accused him outright of siding with the African population against them, against the landowners.
So they turned on him.
Completely. They launched a smear campaign, dragged his name through the mud, and it worked. It proved successful enough to force his removal from office in September 1836.
But the iconic detail, the thing that really stands out, is what happened when he left Jamaica.
Ah, the candelabrum.
Exactly. The black community, who clearly saw him as their champion against the planters, they gifted him this magnificent silver candelabrum, and it was inscribed, expressing their grateful remembrance of his efforts to relieve their suffering and to redress their wrongs. That's an incredible testament, isn't it, for that era?
It really is, and his fight didn't start when he got back home to Britain. He continued to advocate for full emancipation in the House of Lords, and critically, in March 1838, he announced something quite bold. He said regardless of what the government decided, he would free all apprentices on his personal estates by August 1st, 1838.
Wow, leading by example.
Totally. And that bold move, it provided sort of the final political push needed. It helped usher in full emancipation across Jamaica on that very same date, August 1st, 1838. And it's fascinating, the legacy. The town of Sligoville, recognized as the first free village established for formerly enslaved people, possibly in the world, was named in his honor.
But what a story.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to the post-emancipation reality. Full freedom is secured in 1838. Now, the established planters, including presumably some of those Irish descendants we talked about, were desperate for cheap labor,
Right.
which led to new schemes.
Absolutely, a labor crisis from their perspective. And this led directly to programs like the Bountied European Immigration.
Bountied immigration. Sounds commercial.
It was. This was a full-on marketing campaign launched across Europe. They
Yeah.
targeted Irish, Scottish, German workers. The advertisements, you can find them in papers like the Limerick Reporter from 1840. They promised almost utopian conditions.
Like what?
Oh, free passage to Jamaica, a comfortable cottage waiting for you, complete with gardens, free medical attention, even education for your children. And specific wages were quoted, 1 shilling and 6 pence sterling for a 9-hour day. Sounds quite enticing on paper.
Right. But the reality on the ground, often very different, wasn't it? How did these newly imported poor European workers actually get on with the established, newly free Jamaican workforce?
Yeah, the reality was grim, and the interaction led to profound cultural friction. The whole experiment failed pretty quickly, actually. Sources from the time state the European emigrants were often, and this is quite a phrase, 100 times more intractable or difficult than the formerly enslaved population they were meant to replace.
100 times more intractable.
That's the quote. There's even this wonderful anecdote, maybe slightly amusing in hindsight, of one frustrated European worker threatening his employer, saying, and I quote, "If there is another rising, I'll join the blacks."
Huh. Shows
Oh.
the tension.
It really does. It highlighted the huge gap between the promised life in the adverts and the actual reality of, well, abuse, poor conditions, and wages often far below what was advertised.
So there was exploitation in the recruitment itself.
Oh, definitely. There was a profitable side to this immigration business. Importers, the agents bringing people over, received 15 pounds per immigrant from the Jamaican government. A tidy sum.
15 pounds a head.
Yep. And there was public dissent back in Ireland about these schemes. People called them man traps. There was a valid concern that the agents recruiting people simply lacked the authority to actually enforce the terms they were advertising. So immigrants arrived expecting one thing and received far less, often suffering terrible abuses with little recourse.
Mm. So despite the failures of that later wave of immigration, that initial settlement back in the 17th century really cemented the Irish as a lasting demographic and cultural force on the island. And it connects directly to Jamaica's national motto, doesn't it? Out of many, one people.
That legacy is genuinely everywhere. Even today, you see the Irish footprint quite clearly in place names that still exist: Carrickfoyle, Charlemont, Clonmel, Ulster Spring, and even Vinegar Hill, named, interestingly, for a famous Irish military defeat back in 1798.
And then there are the less visible cultural echoes, which are just as profound, maybe even more so.
Absolutely, like the red stripes you see on the side of the Jamaican Constabulary Force pants.
Yeah.
That specific design was patterned after the uniform of the Royal Irish Constabulary,
They're lying.
a direct visual link.
I never knew that.
And linguists have pointed out structural and tonal similarities between the unique inflections and rhythm of Jamaican patois and the traditional Irish lilt, subtle echoes across centuries.
Fascinating. So just to summarize this deep dive then, the arc of the Irish in Jamaica is really one of intense change and eventually integration. It flows for that forced displacement under Cromwell through the establishment of a planter class, and then remarkably culminates centuries later with the championing of the enslaved by Lord Sligo.
Yeah, and the source material, the research we've drawn on, it clearly shows that while the genesis of the Out of Many really occurred right after the English conquest, with all these different groups arriving, the political and social groundwork necessary for the emergence of one people that took, well, several generations more, as the sources put it. It really only accelerated after 1834 and emancipation.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to
Yeah.
maybe mull over. How do we reconcile this historical fact?
Yeah.
The intense pain of forced migration inflicted upon one generation of Irish settlers directly created the conditions, the privilege that allowed some of their descendants to become slave owners in the next generation, only for completely separate Irish noblemen generations later to become the island's fiercest voice for abolition.
Yeah.
That cycle of pain, privilege, power, and perhaps redemption. It remains one of the sharpest, most complex historical ironies we've uncovered in Jamaica's story. Something to think about.